The notice arrived on a quiet morning, folded neatly and slipped into the mailbox like any other piece of routine mail. At first glance, it looked ordinary, the kind of envelope homeowners learn to ignore until the weekend. But the moment it was opened, the weight of its contents hit hard. The HOA had issued a fine so large it felt unreal, a number that seemed more like a typo than a penalty. $350,000. Not for a criminal act. Not for fraud. But for alleged violations on land that had been owned, maintained, and paid for in full. The fine was presented with cold confidence. According to the document, multiple violations had been recorded over several years. Unauthorized structures. Improper land use. Failure to comply with community standards. Each accusation stacked neatly on top of the other, building a case that ended with a threat that was impossible to ignore. If the fine was not paid, foreclosure proceedings would begin. No room for discussion. No mention of mediation. Just an assumption of guilt and a demand for payment. At first, the shock blurred everything else. The property in question was not a manicured suburban lot with a white fence and matching mailboxes. It was open land. Old land. Purchased long before the neighborhood existed in its current form. It had been there before the HOA, before the development signs, before the perfectly spaced houses and smooth asphalt roads. The land had always been treated as separate, untouchable, and outside the reach of any neighborhood authority. But now the HOA claimed otherwise. The violations listed were vague but deliberate. Fencing that allegedly crossed HOA boundaries. Agricultural use deemed incompatible with community aesthetics. Heavy equipment supposedly lowering property values. Even the presence of livestock was framed as a disturbance, despite the land being zoned for it long before the first foundation in the neighborhood was poured. The document assumed ignorance. It spoke as if the recipient had no understanding of property law, no access to records, and no leverage. It was written with the tone of an organization used to being obeyed, not questioned. The kind of authority that grows comfortable when no one pushes back. What made it worse was the timing. The HOA had waited until the development was fully occupied, until property values were high, and until residents had grown accustomed to the idea that the association controlled everything within sight. Lawns. Paint colors. Driveways. And now, apparently, land they did not own. Over the following days, more notices arrived. Certified letters. Emails. Follow-ups referencing the same fine, the same deadline, the same threat of foreclosure. The pressure was intentional. The HOA wanted panic. Panic leads to quick settlements. Panic leads to payment plans. Panic leads to silence. Behind the scenes, the HOA board had already painted a picture for the neighborhood. They framed the situation as a necessary enforcement action. A rogue landowner refusing to comply. A holdout threatening community harmony. Residents were told the fines existed to protect them, to maintain standards, to prevent chaos. And many believed it. Construction vehicles were soon spotted near the edge of the land. Survey flags appeared without permission. Inspectors took photos from the road, documenting evidence for violations that had never existed. It was clear the HOA wasn't just issuing paperwork. They were preparing for a legal confrontation, confident they would win. What they didn't realize was that this land had a history they had never bothered to check. Years earlier, when the area was still quiet and undeveloped, the land had been part of a larger parcel. One that included access roads, utility easements, and legal boundaries that were later reused by developers without fully closing old agreements. Deeds had changed hands. Paperwork had been filed hastily. Corners had been cut. And one critical detail had been overlooked in the rush to build homes and sell dreams. The HOA's authority depended entirely on the assumption that the neighborhood owned the land beneath its roads, shared spaces, and infrastructure. That assumption had never been challenged. No one questioned it because no one had reason to. Until now. The fine continued to hang overhead like a countdown clock. 30 days to comply. 25. 20. Each reminder was sharper than the last. The HOA escalated its language, hinting at legal fees, liens, and irreversible consequences. They expected fear. They expected surrender. Instead, something else happened. Old documents were pulled from storage. Deeds yellowed with age. Survey maps drawn by hand, then digitized years later without cross-referencing original boundaries. County records that hadn't been reviewed since before the HOA existed. Slowly, quietly, a different picture began to form. The land wasn't just outside HOA jurisdiction. It was connected to something much larger. The access road the neighborhood relied on. The drainage system underneath the streets. The utility easements feeding power and water into every home. They all traced back to the same original parcel. A parcel that had never been fully transferred. A parcel that had been partially sold, partially leased, and partially forgotten. The HOA's fine was built on the assumption that ownership flowed one way. But ownership doesn't care about assumptions. It cares about records. As the deadline approached, the HOA pushed harder. They scheduled enforcement actions. They warned residents of potential disruptions caused by the non-compliant landowner. They prepared legal filings, confident the situation would end quietly, with a check and a signature. They had no idea that the very land supporting their authority was about to be questioned. And they certainly didn't know that the fine they issued had triggered a deeper review that would expose something no one in the neighborhood was prepared for. Because the issue was no longer about violations. It was about who truly owned the ground beneath their feet. Once the initial shock faded, the situation became less emotional and more methodical. Panic had been exactly what the HOA expected, but panic never arrived. Instead, the fine forced a closer look at something that had been left untouched for years. Ownership. Not the kind assumed by fences and street signs, but the kind written in ink, stamped by counties, and buried in records most people never bother to read. The first discovery was subtle. A boundary description that didn't quite match the HOA's master map. The association's documents showed clean, modern lines, clearly separating private lots from common areas. But the county's older surveys told a messier story. Lines curved where they shouldn't have. Measurements overlapped. Some parcels didn't terminate where the HOA claimed they did. Digging deeper revealed something worse. The developer who originally built the neighborhood had not purchased the land outright the way residents assumed. Instead, portions had been acquired through layered agreements, temporary easements, and conditional transfers. In the rush to develop, several of those conditions were never completed. No final signatures. No recorded releases. No updated deeds. The HOA had been operating on borrowed ground. The access road leading into the neighborhood was the first red flag. It appeared on HOA maps as community-owned infrastructure, but the original deed told a different story. The road sat entirely on land that had never been transferred to the association or the developer. It had simply been used, paved, and treated as if permission was permanent. It wasn't. Then came the utilities. Water lines, sewer access, electrical conduits. Every single one crossed through land that the HOA did not own. Easements existed, but many were limited in scope, written decades earlier, and never expanded to cover a full residential development. Legally, they allowed passage. They did not allow control. The deeper the review went, the more fragile the HOA's position became. What made it worse for them was timing. The fine had been issued aggressively, with foreclosure language that escalated the matter beyond simple enforcement. That move triggered protections and legal scrutiny they hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, the association wasn't just enforcing rules. It was asserting authority over land it may not have had any right to govern. Behind closed doors, the HOA began to sense trouble. Requests for documentation were answered slowly. Some records were missing. Others contradicted each other. The confidence that fueled the $350,000 fine began to crack. The neighborhood, meanwhile, remained unaware of how serious the situation had become. Residents continued their routines, assuming the HOA was handling a minor dispute with an uncooperative landowner. They had no idea that the land supporting their homes, roads, and utilities was under review. Surveyors were brought in quietly. Independent professionals with no connection to the HOA or the developer. Their findings were precise, unemotional, and devastating. The boundaries used by the HOA did not align with recorded property lines. In several places, entire sections of the neighborhood extended beyond what the association legally controlled. The biggest revelation came from a forgotten document buried deep in county archives. A master parcel deed from years before the development existed. It showed that ownership of the land had never been fully separated the way everyone believed. Portions had been sold. Portions leased. And one critical section had remained intact. That section wasn't small. Small. It connected everything. The HOA's common areas. The roads. The drainage basins. Even the land beneath several rows of houses. All of it traced back to a single original parcel that had never been fully relinquished. The assumption that it belonged to the HOA was just that, an assumption passed from developer to board to resident without verification. The fine now looked reckless. Instead of holding leverage, the HOA had exposed itself. The foreclosure threat, meant to intimidate, had become a liability. If the HOA didn't own the land, it couldn't fine it. It couldn't foreclose on it. And it certainly couldn't regulate it. Worse still, by issuing penalties and threatening enforcement, the HOA may have violated property rights it never had authority over. That opened the door to countersuits, damages, and injunctions. The association's legal position, once assumed to be solid, now sat on unstable ground. Internally, panic replaced confidence. Emergency meetings were held. Lawyers were consulted. The narrative began to shift from enforcement to damage control. But the damage was already done. The paper trail existed. The surveys were complete. The deeds were clear. The HOA's power depended entirely on perception. On the belief that it controlled the neighborhood. That belief was about to be tested. The final confirmation came when ownership records were cross-referenced with tax payments. For years, taxes on critical portions of the land had been paid by someone other than the HOA. Quietly. Consistently. Without missing a single year. The association had never noticed because it never checked. The realization hit hard. The land they thought they governed wasn't theirs. And the person they tried to intimidate wasn't powerless. The fine had triggered a chain reaction the HOA could no longer stop. What began as an attempt to enforce rules had turned into a full exposure of the foundation beneath the neighborhood itself. By the time the HOA understood the scale of the problem, it was already too late to reverse course. Because the next step wasn't research. It was action. And when that action came, the entire neighborhood would feel it. By the time the HOA fully understood what had been uncovered, the situation had moved far beyond fines and warning letters. The illusion of control that had defined the association for years was collapsing under the weight of verified records, surveyed boundaries, and payment histories that told a story no board meeting could rewrite. Authority that isn't backed by ownership doesn't just weaken, it disappears. The first visible change was silence. The letters stopped. The reminders vanished. The foreclosure language was quietly abandoned. Where there had once been urgency and threats, there was now hesitation. Every step forward carried risk, and the HOA knew it. Any attempt to push enforcement could trigger legal consequences far worse than backing down. But backing down wasn't simple. The fine had been issued publicly. The accusations had circulated through newsletters and community updates. Residents had been told there was a problem landowner threatening neighborhood standards. Now the HOA faced a new problem, explaining why that landowner suddenly seemed untouchable. The truth arrived not through rumor, but through documentation. Legal notices were filed, not as threats, but as clarifications. Property boundaries were formally asserted. Ownership of key parcels was recorded clearly and unmistakably. The access road. The utility corridors. The shared drainage land. All confirmed as part of a single, continuous holding that had never been transferred to the HOA. The neighborhood was built around land it did not own. The impact was immediate. The HOA's legal team advised restraint. Without ownership or expanded easements, the association's authority over large portions of the neighborhood was non-existent. Rules tied to land use could not be enforced where jurisdiction did not apply. Fines tied to violations became invalid overnight. Then came the unavoidable question of liability. For years, the HOA had collected fees, enforced rules, and maintained areas it never legally controlled. If challenged, that history could become a serious problem. The board faced the possibility of refund demands, civil claims, and regulatory scrutiny. The power dynamic had flipped completely. Residents began to notice changes. Maintenance schedules were paused. Planned upgrades were delayed. Committees that once moved confidently now stalled. Explanations became vague. Transparency, once promised, suddenly felt limited. Eventually, the HOA had no choice but to acknowledge reality. A formal correction was issued. The fine was withdrawn in its entirety. No appeal process. No compromise. Just a quiet reversal framed as an administrative oversight. There was no apology, no admission of wrongdoing, only an attempt to minimize exposure. But the withdrawal of the fine wasn't the end. Because ownership doesn't just cancel penalties. It creates leverage. With legal control over critical infrastructure, the balance of power shifted in a way the HOA had never considered. Access rights. Maintenance permissions. Easement terms. Everything the neighborhood depended on now required cooperation rather than enforcement. Negotiations followed. Carefully worded. Suddenly respectful. The association that once issued threats now sought agreements. Long-term easements. Usage permissions. Formalized boundaries. All offered with urgency, because without them, the HOA's future was uncertain. The neighborhood learned the truth slowly, through updates that hinted at structural changes without explaining their origin. Most residents never saw the full picture. They only noticed that the association's tone had changed. Less commanding. More cautious. What had started as a $350,000 fine ended as a lesson written into the foundation of the community. Rules do not override ownership. Authority does not exist without consent. And power built on assumptions collapses the moment facts are introduced. The land remained unchanged. Quiet. Unimpressed by titles or boards or notices. It had existed long before the HOA and would remain long after. The only thing that changed was who understood that truth. The HOA returned to enforcing paint colors and lawn lengths, avoiding the edges of its claimed authority. The landowner continued operations without interference, backed by records instead of fear. And the neighborhood stood as it always had, carefully maintained, neatly organized, and unknowingly resting on land it never truly owned. The fine that was meant to intimidate had exposed everything. And once ownership was revealed, there was nothing left for the HOA to threaten.